I promise all of you, I will not do another video about Brian after this, like ever again. This is going to be my last video about high impact commercials. I just felt the need to make this video because one of Brian's latest videos is going to have thousands of people running around making the truth community, or whatever you want to call it, look even worse than it already does. Because it's probably convinced thousands of people that there is no such thing as a contagious disease. The video I'm talking about is this video of Brian's titled, Earth-shattering proof people cannot transmit disease. Straight from the CDC. And in this video, Brian totally misreads a CDC public health report that is actually about people being successfully vaccinated against influenza. Like, this article, like this public health report, I kid you not, it's about people who are vaccinated, successfully vaccinated, they use the term inoculated, against influenza. And Brian is reading it because those people were successfully inoculated against influenza. They didn't get influenza. So Brian is reading these people not getting influenza as proof that there is no such thing as contagious disease. But before I prove that to be the case, I want to begin by proving that Brian doesn't have a fucking clue as to what he's talking about, and he has like something going on that, like, psychologically, I don't know, like psychologically, mentally, he's got something going on that affects what he comprehends. Like, he's allowing like an internal bias to affect how he comprehends what he reads, or something like that. I'm going to prove this by showing what he says about influenza supposedly not being isolated. And this video clip is from the very same video that I'm looking at, this earth-shattering proof. So here's what Brian says.
How great are the difficulties surrounding the study of the nature of the virus of influenza, which, by the way, to this day has not been isolated per mainstream media, CDC, WHO.
Governo and Mentis.
But the document he's reading from in this video says, quote, the study was begun on November 13th with an experiment in which a suspension of a freshly isolated culture of Pfeiffer's bacillus was instilled into the nose of 3 non-immunes and 3 controls who had a history of an attack in the present epidemic. But yet, Brian begins by claiming that it hasn't been isolated. And I mean, this article doesn't just say it once. They refer to freshly isolated cultures of this virus on several occasions. But yet, somehow, Brian doesn't make the connection. Somehow, Brian can still read this, and I'm sure he's read it multiple times. He can read this multiple times and still start off the video by claiming that it's never been isolated. Very interesting behavior. Definitely worth studying. If I was a psychologist, I would definitely want to study that behavior.
Another experiment was made at a later date with a suspension of a number of different pure cultures of Pfeiffer's bacillus, of which 4 were recently isolated. 10 presumably non-immune volunteers were inoculated with the same negative result.
Governo and Mentis.
And not only does Brian ignore this fact, he also glosses over other very important details that might raise questions about the real reasons these men didn't appear to get sick. Like this very important bit of information at the beginning.
These volunteers had been exposed in some degree to an epidemic of influenza, that's what they called it, at the training camp, or at some station prior to coming to Deer Island. 47 of the men were without history of an attack of influenza during the recent epidemic, and 39 of these were without a history of an attack of such illness at any time during their lives. Now, this is very, very interesting because, like I said, they tried like crazy. They pulled out all the stops, up to and including
Governo and Mentis.
So Brian just glosses over the fact that these men have actually come into contact with the virus already. That they have a proven history that they've, one, come into contact with the virus, And two, I mean, these 39 men who had never had a history of influenza, those 39 men could have a natural immunity because of a naturally existing antibody in their blood. And there is plenty historical precedent for this occurring with other diseases, like this guy. And this guy, who's known as the man with the golden arm, he's important because essentially his blood inadvertently cured millions of people. Well, not cured, but I guess, yeah, inadvertently cured millions of people of this Rhesus disease or this RH disease. And essentially, this RH disease is like when the woman's blood and the baby's blood, they're like different. Like one is RH negative, one is RH positive, and this causes the woman's body to attack the baby, and then it causes them to have miscarriages. So this guy's blood, he donated a bunch of blood, and like he didn't donate a bunch of blood knowing he had this antibody. He donated a bunch of blood because, you know, he needed a bunch of blood as a kid, so he decided to make it his life goal to donate a bunch of fucking blood. Anyway, not important. What's important, though, is that scientists actually found out that in his blood, there's a rare antibody known as Rh immune globulin, or anti-D. So these guys in this study, these 39 guys who had never had a history of influenza in their life, maybe they just had something similar to that in their blood, like an antibody that protected them against these viruses, or this, at least this one particular virus. And of course, the other 47 guys who were already exposed to influenza, although they didn't show symptoms of influenza, they could have gotten it but were asymptomatic, and thus those guys could have had antibodies already. The next bit of information that Brian is either totally ignoring or is just ignorant of what it means is what the article says about inoculation. Here's what Brian says.
The experiments consisted of inoculations with pure cultures of Pfeiffer's bacillus with secretions from the upper respiratory passages and with blood from typical cases of influenza. So these people were clearly sick, and they took secretions of upper respiratory passages and blood from sick people to well people. The study was begun on November, and what we're talking about here is the question, is there such a thing as contagion?
Governo and Mentis.
So here it appears like he thinks inoculation means to simply take from one and give to another, or something like that. But inoculation is synonymous with vaccination. Of course, they're not exactly the same. There are differences between inoculating somebody with something and your typical vaccination. But these experiments are just showing the different ways people could be inoculated. And it says this at the very start of the article when it says, the experiments consisted of inoculations with pure cultures of Pfeiffer's bacillus, with secretions from the upper respiratory passage, and with blood from typical cases of influenza. So some were done by instilling some of the isolated virus into their nose, some were done by spraying it at the subjects, and others were done by injection. I'd say the only problem with these experiments is, as I said, it appears like all the people who took part in the experiments most likely already had a natural immunity to the influenza from coming into contact with it before the experiments. Brian also completely misrepresents an experiment that's talked about. There is this experiment where they took inoculated men and put them in a room with sick men, had them converse with the sick men, and had the sick men cough into the faces of the inoculated men. And Brian erroneously presents this as an experiment where they are trying to get totally normal men with no immunity to influenza sick, as if these men weren't inoculated.
Unfiltered and filtered from the upper respiratory tract of typical cases of influenza in the active stage of the disease. In these experiments, a total of 30 men were subjected to inoculation by means of spray, swab, or both of the nose and throat. The interval clasping between securing secretions from the donors and inoculation of the volunteers was progressively reduced in these experiments, so that in the third series, the interval at the most was 30 seconds. In no instance was an attack of influenza produced in any one of the subjects. Still couldn't do it, man. We tried and could not do it.
Guverno and Mentis.
So here he's clearly misunderstanding the inoculation with them trying to get them sick. They weren't trying to get them sick, Brian. They were inoculating them. The sprays or whatever, those are inoculations. And basically, they're seeing the side effects of the inoculations. They're like, okay, if we inoculate them, will they end up getting the virus? Will they develop symptoms? And they're seeing like, okay, like, how long after collecting the sample can we administer the sample? Can we like give the inoculation without there being an immune response? Now, once again, though, I will repeat, this is a flawed experiment because these guys are very likely to have antibodies against this virus. So it's very likely that they're already inoculated.
Then total exposure amounted to about 3/4 of an hour for each volunteer. So about 45 minutes each person was exposed to another sick person, close communication, talking, conversing, coughing into the face of that person. What was the result? None of these volunteers developed any symptoms of influenza following this experiment. This is far from sanitary conditions, and they still couldn't get contagion. We're trying to get contagion. We just can't do it.
Guverno and Mentis.
And they couldn't get contagion because they were inoculated. Now you have to ask yourselves, do you really think that Brian doesn't know what the word inoculation means? And if he doesn't know what it means, why would he not do a simple search to find out what it means? This is either the product of malicious intent or gross incompetence. I want to finish the video off by quickly pointing some things out. One, I want to point out the fact that it is possible that, like I said at the start of this video, Brian's beliefs are affecting how he comprehends what he reads, and probably sees. And I find this to be a really interesting bit of psychological insight that I really do think should be further explored, if it's not already further explored. Maybe there's already like psychological literature on this, and I'm not aware of it, but if there's not, this should really be explored. The second thing that I want to point out is that while making this video, I thought about how flat earthers do a very similar thing. How, for example, Eric Dubé refers to a number of experiments to attempt to prove flat earth that actually don't prove flat earth at all and are either totally made up experiments or in some cases they actually disprove a flat earth. And then actually one of my followers on Odyssey linked me to a video of Brian talking to a flat earther. And of course this follower of mine's also had put in their comment, birds of a feather flock together. And when I watched the video of Brian and this flat earther guy, it left no doubt in my mind about Brian being either a shill or grossly incompetent. So, with all of that said, I'm going to just say farewell to Brian. I wish you luck, Brian, with whatever you're dealing with, or whatever you're trying to overcome in life, whatever you're chasing in life. I wish you luck with that. And I especially wish luck to everyone who is subscribed to Brian, who follows Brian, and who mindlessly believes Brian, because you're all really going to need it.
Yeah, it's interesting, the U.S. Secretary of Education, he did like some tweet thread, like it was like a month ago, and he's like, follow the data on the mask, and he cited a few studies. He cited one study from North Carolina which said forced masking of kids work, but it had no control group because that was required in every school. So they just said it worked without comparing it against what if you didn't do that, and people pointed that out immediately. Then he cited a study from the university, or from Wisconsin about it, and the researcher who did the study immediately responded to the tweet and said, we found no conclusive evidence on the forced masking, and basically said that you should not use my study to do that.